Again, two fantastic people that we're going to have talking. I just want to kind of provide some context to this. And in one way, I feel like a producer of, I don't know if you know the show Homeland. Homeland was often critiqued as, you guys are always ahead of the news cycle. If you think about it, yesterday we had kind of a EU-US discussion, which was 3 days after Angela Merkel made her pretty controversial remarks. Today we're having an energy panel on the same day as President Trump may or may not announce whatever he's doing with the Paris Climate Accord. So tomorrow a session may be ahead of the news cycle, so we don't know. Obviously we live in a world that's tremendously energy constrained. We have conflicting forces going on between renewable energy, conventional energy. Something Jake said to me was pretty profound. Many people in the world don't have choice. We do. Why should they not have choice? And often in the first world, we forget there's 1.3 billion people that don't have electricity, full stop. And to really bring it home, we talked about Africa this morning. Africa is a continent of over 1 billion people, yet 650 million people in 41 countries do not have access to electricity, just don't have access. Twice the size of the United States. Only 5 countries have more than 50% of their population have access, and most of it's not reliable. And the average access is 20%. And energy is necessary for economic development, social progress. And most people just want access to affordable, reliable, and accessible energy. And if you deliver it to me in a cleaner, non-polluting way, great. So it's kind of this world that we kind of live within. And I think Mike and David bring certainly two very broad perspectives to the room. So Mike, why don't we start with you and kind of, you watch the energy world very closely from your perch here at Kellogg and Northwestern. Do you want to talk to us a little bit about what you're seeing out there?
Right. What we're seeing now really is an evolution, as many of us are noticing, toward renewables. But in point of fact, we have this intermediate zone where we're actually utilizing more of, for lack of a better word, cleaner fossil. For instance, using natural gas as opposed to coal. In fact, yesterday there was a news announcement that the Bryant power plant in Massachusetts was shut down yesterday as the last coal-fired plant in the whole state. And so this is the way things are going now. And in fact, we all know that gas gives the same amount of energy with half of the climate burden with regard to CO2. So it's a good intermediate step. But on the other hand, we need to go the next step in terms of how do we deal with real renewables, like for instance, solar and wind. And from our perspective, this is coming, and it's coming rapidly, and it's being driven by the fact that the cost of these technologies is really dropping rapidly. But it's going to still require significant adjunct technologies in order to really make the kind of market penetration that we would like to see. For instance, in places like Africa, where energy has to really duplicate the essentially what I would call the cell phone phenomenon. In other words, you don't go into a place like Africa and then set up landlines and a whole infrastructure for communication. You set up cell towers and do the whole wireless communication thing and do it successfully. The same thing is true with energy. In places where the sun shines a lot, the wind blows, there we need to set up the infrastructure for renewables, and then we need to solve these other adjunct problems, for instance, storage, which is critical, in order to make this happen on a broad scale. So basically, storage is really where it's going to be at with regard to really having renewables make significant penetration in the very near term. In other words, rapid penetration. Now, we're coming along with that, certainly. We're coming along with improved battery technologies, and many utilities are experimenting today, more than experimenting, actually implementing lithium battery technologies at remote sites with good effect. But if you look at it seriously and in detail, batteries are going to improve maybe 3 to 5 times over the next 10 years with regard to the amount of storage per volume. And so, is that really enough? And the answer is no, because it may be okay for electric vehicles, but it's never going to fly an airplane. It's never going to power an ocean-going ship. For those, you really need to use a liquid fuel. And one of my favorite examples of liquid fuels is not really looking at the Tesla, which we all love in terms of a really good vehicle for utilizing electricity. Let's look at a more modest vehicle like the Chevy Volt, for instance. The Chevy Volt carries around about 500 pounds of batteries, and those 500 pounds of batteries will give you about a 40-mile range. If you look at the equivalent of what gasoline can do, a gallon of gasoline weighs about 7 pounds, and will give you the same 40-mile range in a vehicle of that weight and size. And so the energy density of storage is important too. And so that's where transportation fuels with regard to airplanes, big ships, et cetera, really are important. And so how do we address that? Well, the only way to address that really is to use renewables to store energy in form of a liquid. And the way to do that is really to recycle the carbon dioxide that's coming out of, for instance, our cleaner natural gas plants, convert it back using solar or wind power into a liquid fuel that we can literally burn again and close the carbon cycle. This gives us an intermediate stopgap as the technologies develop over the next 5 to 10, 15 years to get us to the point where other storage solutions present themselves. And so this kind of approach, a multifaceted approach, is really the way we need to approach the renewables and storage in a kind of holistic way. And so I think really that's what will benefit the global energy picture in the sense that being in the first world, we have lots of choices, as you mentioned. But if you're in Africa or Central Asia or someplace where the grid doesn't exist, we really need to have implementations that are user-friendly for that vast number of people who are out there and whose economies will really blossom based on, and their entire lifestyle will in fact blossom based on this kind of utilization.
Great, thanks Mike. I think that's a very interesting world, and I think we don't think about the closed loop CO2 cycle very much. So David, you bring a very different perspective as an investor, but more on, so just distinguish, David is not a venture capitalist, so he's doing project finance on sustainable projects. So, and I think often people don't think about that as being a real driver for innovation. So do you want to kind of give us a lens into what we mean by that?
Sure. So just you'll see on my bio here, I also teach here at Kellogg, so I feel very comfortable doing a pop quiz here with this audience. Quick guess, between the years 2000 and, pick a year, 2015, 16, how much has been invested in the U.S. renewable industry? Plant facility, wind farms, solar, rough numbers. I'll spot you billions of dollars of rounding error. How many of you think it's $10 billion? Raise your hand. $100 billion. $500 billion. All right. So it's actually much closer to $500 billion, and the real number is probably well north of that. So between the years 2000 and 2015, 16, 17, we've installed about 100 gigawatts. A gigawatt is approximately a coal-fired power plant. So we've put in basically 100 coal-fired power plants or nukes equivalents in 15 years. And so renewable energy has been around since, windmills have been around for example, in the California valleys. You can drive into Palm Springs and you can see basically 30, 40-year-old wind farms. So wind energy has been around for a long time. So the really important question is, what happened in 2001, 2002 to drive exponential growth? That thing that we talked about throughout the morning, disruption. What happened? Any guess? So I'll tell you the usual guesses that people make. Technology. No, windmill the day before and the day after was pretty much the same. The solar cell before and after that 2-year period was pretty much the same. Second guess that people make. Government regulation and subsidies. No, the investment tax credit, the ITC, and the PTC, the production tax credits, have been around for quite a while, before and after. So that didn't change. So what changed? And in a way, this gets back to Jen's conversation earlier this morning. A group of finance guys, treasury guys, inside of the private sector got together and said, there's something fundamentally wrong here with the financing mechanism for renewable energy. The US subsidies are geared towards tax credits. And as a developer of a wind farm, we have no revenue and we have no profits. So we can't take advantage of the tax credits that are meant to jumpstart this industry. So they created a very, very innovative financial instrument, euphemistically called the tax equity flip structure. And that was to align the interests of the private sector folks that had quote unquote tax appetite with the folks that didn't have tax appetite to be able to fully leverage what was good for the utility, what was going to be good for the government, and it was a financial innovation. And from the years 2001, 2, and 3, you started to see what was effectively a flat market of next to zero grow to $1 billion, $2 billion, $10 billion, $100 billion a year of investment that went into it. So finance as an innovative instrument is really what I spend a lot of my time doing. It's what we teach here at Kellogg in the class that I teach. But let me go to the opposite end. So what we've just talked about here was the financing of gigawatt facilities, things that line ridges that are also known as utility scale. Let me go to why finance is equally important on the other end. So the speakers this morning were talking about Africa. So one of the coolest things that's happening in Africa in this whole grid missing, bypassing the grid, is distributed solar. So you've got people that earn, pick a number, $1,500 a year, $2,000 a year, your average middle class in a developing country. They get a solar panel of 500 watts. That's barely enough to power your hairdryer. Put that in perspective. But it's enough to light 3 light bulbs in the house. One for the kitchen, one for dad and mom in their workplace, and one for the kid to read. That means they get to do homework. That means they get to extend their day. It transforms their life. Using 5-year-old prices, that's $500, not much. But when you earn $2,000 a year, that's a major car. All right. So here's the problem that we in this room sometimes have as a prejudice. We like technology. We like product companies. So every company that's in Africa that's selling distributed solar, we romanticize how important they are, and they raise a pile of money. They sometimes raise it from DFIs, sometimes from donors, and then they go and put these solar cells out, all right? And they change lives. And then they run into a problem on their balance sheet, and that is that they realize that most of these solar panels are actually either leased out or it's debt. But the company is structured as a product company. So for the older folks in this room, which I'm one of them, you remember how our parents bought their first refrigerator? I mean, this is America, right? Or their first car, they bought it on time. So GE Appliances was really a credit corp. And every car company is a credit corp. And so in order to spread solar power across all of Africa or India, it means that the product company has to acknowledge that their balance sheet and their corporate structure needs to emulate that of a lease corp and a debt-oriented business model. Because and so the unlocking of the distributed energy in Africa and developing countries is not about the cheap solar panel. It's about creating one of the most boring entities you can possibly think about, which is a credit corp. Right? Alongside what is sexy and we want to see the light bulb. Okay? So that's why I think between those two stories, we're so compelled to really think about what are the financing mechanisms that align the interests and create highly scalable, multi-$100 billion investment opportunities in these things that seemingly look like the public good or the environmental good.
Yeah. Nothing's gone. I mean, I think the role of financial innovation is obviously a lot of the time overlooked. Mm-hmm. And I think unfortunately financial innovation and financial in the same sentence became a bit discredited in 2008, right? So people get kind of, what's happening, but I think it's very important. And we do a lot of work with Milken Institute around this.
Exactly.
And a couple of folk here. I think it's very
Yeah, I gave a this probably was the wrong thing to say, but I was at a very progressive conference about 7 years ago, and I said, oh, you know, it's sort of like, you know, finance and greed is sort of like the NRA slogan about guns, you know. Finance doesn't create greed, people do.
Yeah.
That didn't quite
Didn't go down.
didn't quite
Didn't have the
go
same effect you had wanted, right?
Yeah.
So, I mean, I think anything, if you can work out how to do something that's positive and make profit at the same time. I remember Bill Clinton saying, you know, that was one of his things, is, hey, you do good working with companies, but make a profit. I mean, that's really powerful.
But I think that to that point, you know, one of the questions I asked the class as we begin this discussion around this topic is, what's the difference between a collateralized debt obligation and a microfinance securitization? You know, and the joke punchline is, well, they're both lending to poor people, right? But why are they so radically different?
Yeah.
One causes the Great Recession, and the other one's an enabler and you know, creates an uplift in society.
Well, we like plain speaking at KIT, so it's good. So, hey, there's two areas I wanted to explore, and obviously everyone's going to wonder about the announcement today, so we'll do that as a second question. But The Economist brought out a really interesting article 3-4 weeks ago where they kind of said renewables has got to a point of success that could actually retard the adoption of renewables because of this conflict between the subsidies that have been driving renewables to a point, and as they take the subsidies off, there's not enough incentive to build baseload. It has to be gas or nuclear or coal. So we've got to go into this kind of weird world is how do you finance baseload and still grow renewables? And maybe the model's wrong. Do you want to kind of, Mike, maybe start with you and then Dave?
Yeah, I think this is an excellent point because in talking to our friends at various utilities, the issue is really this baseload problem is never going to go away. And so as a consequence, it has to be dealt with in a direct fashion, and there has to be an evolution, but there are many pathways to do this evolution. And what the right mix is now is really a point of discussion. And so as more renewables come on, then things like grid modeling become important. In other words, how do you best use the renewables and not find yourself in a cul-de-sac where you have these periods during the day, during the week, where you can't get there from here with regard to providing the power where it needs to be. And so that kind of modeling aspect is important as well. And so that problem has to be really solved very quickly, and it's going to present a real bottleneck to the widespread adoption of renewables by current utilities that are really you know, wedded to today's technology in ways that, you know, honestly, it's not a knock on anyone in the sense that that base load must be there, and we all rely on it, and you know, you just can't get away from it. And so I think the solution is going to have to be an evolution of hybrid solutions and modeling that gets one to where one needs to go.
Yeah. Dave, we talked when we were at Milken together about the whole, in an emerging area, which is this nexus of food, water, and energy. And you know, 5 years ago, nobody actually combined those three things, and it's kind of evolving that. How are you seeing that? Are you seeing more visibility and understanding around how those three interact with each other, and how do we reconcile all that?
Before I answer
that,
can I address your one
No,
question
absolutely.
there? And this is one of the great ironies. We love the idea of markets and market making, and renewables is a classic example of where the subsidies worked, and the markets have now spoken. And one of the things about baseload that I think is so I spent 25 years in high tech, and one of the really important things about spending time in high tech is the life cycle of the industries are relatively short. So within a relatively modest career, you can watch 2 or 3 life cycles play out in 7 to 10 years. That's part of learning. And one of the things that we observe about disruption is that phase 1 of a disruption is almost always to replace what you know with this new technology. So, you know, the CD-ROM book was basically a book, but you now had it on CD. And it isn't until phase 2 when 2 or 3 things come together where an alternative topology or an alternative way of doing it comes about. This base load question, I think, is going to be really interesting because as batteries come about, you actually now disrupt or replace the need for peaker plants.
Yes.
Or as many peaker plants, which fundamentally changes the PUC, the way you get compensated, and really disrupts that. And is that 5, 7, 8 years from now? Or more, or less, right?
Yeah.
And so I think this whole issue of the base load and the architecture of the base load is probably going to go through a very major shift as 1 + 1 comes about and intersects between renewables and storage. That's, I think, one of the key disruptors that's going to take place in our grid.
I think we've got to avoid, and I know in the US that hasn't been publicised, is the massive blackout in South Australia late last year where the whole state went dark for 36 hours because of a combination of they took out the baseload plants, were relying on renewables, and the whole thing kind of collapsed on itself based on a catastrophic event, and it cost business hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of millions of dollars. And business said, I'm not investing in this state anymore, in a first world country, because you can't give me reliable power. So I think we've got to avoid those things in the interim while storage catches up. So David, water, energy and food,
Okay.
do they actually relate to each other at all? Or?
So one of the old jokes in agriculture is that agriculture is nothing but water and oil.
Yep.
Oil is the source of most of the fertilizers. It's obviously, everybody thinks about it in terms of the tractor and the semi-truck that's hauling things, but actually the biggest use of oil in a farming situation really is fertilizers, pesticides, herbicides. All those are basically oil derivatives, as well as the fuels that are necessary to run things, and then water. Between those two, you pretty much have it. And I think that what we're recognizing is in agriculture, between the urbanization trends that are taking place that are eating away at the arable land, the amount of soil degradation that's taking place, what are then the strategies to maximize the productivity of the water and the productivity of the energy. And so an ag metric that you probably have never seen, we don't really use, is sort of dollars of output per gallon of or BTU of energy, and the dollar of output per gallon of water. And increasingly, you're going to see us becoming much more sensitive to those metrics.
Yeah, that's interesting. It's a very important measure. So a panel on energy wouldn't be complete without a question about the potential announcement of the US withdrawing from the Paris Climate Accord. I have a view, but do you think it even I mean, there's a big political thing, but does it matter? Is it going to change the trajectory that we're on? And if it does, why? And if it doesn't, any other implications? So, Mike, do you want to take a stab at that one?
If you had asked me that question even 2 or 3 years ago, I would have said that it's going to have a massively negative impact. I'm less certain about that now, simply because what I think has been clear to probably a lot of people in this room is that corporations worldwide have taken it upon themselves to essentially accept renewables and the whole sustainability picture as part of doing good business. And everyone I've been speaking to in the last few years basically is telling me about all of the wonderful ways in which they are, without government intervention or without imposition of regulation, what they're doing is finding out that basically they can do, quote unquote, the right thing and at the same time make a profit. And so they're building this, as we've already heard earlier this morning, into their corporate structure. In other words, you don't have a sustainability department or an energy efficiency department. Just make it part of your business plan. And as a consequence, it's built in, and what people are finding very quickly now is that it's good for business. And as a consequence, I'm a little bit more positive in the sense that if, for instance, the politics don't really go the way of the Paris Accord, things will still be driven by the corporate world, especially in a globalized economy, and it's probably still going to go in the right direction. Now, that's not to say that the impetus from government and global agreements isn't important, for instance, in making sure that the third world is getting their fair share of the technology and the focus on bringing in technologies that will actually prevent future climate issues and so forth. So basically, we're so connected now that it's impossible to say with certainty that it's not going to have a negative impact, but at least from my perception now, I think the corporate world is really, certainly seriously doing the right thing now, as opposed to what my view would have been even 3 or 5 years ago.
Yeah, real bottom-up change.
It is. It's bottom-up change, exactly.
David?
One positive and 2 negatives.
Okay.
Anybody read that 62.3% of shareholder votes yesterday at Exxon?
Exxon, yep.
Right.
Okay. So the market has spoken. So the shareholder vote at Exxon about forcing Exxon to take a look at climate exposure, the whole oil and stranded assets issues. And by the way, what's actually hidden in that 62.3% is you all need to remember that the shareholders of Exxon are generally not people like you and I. They're large institutions that hold very significant blocks. So the 62.3% is made up of CalPERS, State Street Global, BlackRock, and on and on and on and on. So the institutional investors are speaking, the market has spoken, that thing that we put on a pedestal, the market is speaking. So, and they're speaking it in the language of risk exposure, as well as opportunity set, but generally in terms of risk exposure. So the market is voting and it's speaking, and to some extent, the Paris Accord, whether we're in or not, the herd has run.
Yeah.
Okay? So it's a little bit like they're late to the party, or they went to the wrong party. The 2 negatives, one is China, and so what we will abdicate is leadership around this issue to China, and China is absolutely driving to grab the stage, and they're doing it. They're going to do it in places that we don't know and don't care a lot about. Y'all remember the New Yorker poster where New York is like this thing and the rest of the United States is like this little sliver, that famous poster? We're sort of like that. We don't see the other half. We're all smart. We know it's not a flat earth. We know there's another half of the hemisphere, but we don't see the other side.
Yeah.
So as far as we, and what China will use is this policy to drive the leadership around oh, by the way, that other side that we don't see, that's called the fast growth part. And to business guys, that's called market. Okay? So that's danger number one. The second negative is I don't believe the government policy right now will do anything to hinder renewable energy because it's mature.
Yeah.
Okay? It's down its cost curve. I think what we are in danger of, and where government always plays a role, is in the subsidies and the granting in advanced research and advanced models. That's their job. And we euphemistically label that things like DARPA, the National Science Foundation, things like that, or policy like California's CARB, okay, to institute and prompt new things. I think that's the second place where we will be damaged, and that is that the administration will throttle back on all these new things. But in terms of the mature things like windmills and all that, and electric cars, I mean that herd's running. But it's our exposure to the new thing. By the way, the new thing is also called innovation.
Yeah, I'd like to echo that too, Dave, because the institutions like this one that really do the cutting edge research and development in these areas, really the innovation itself is going to suffer if in fact the government agencies pull back on funding these things. And so I think that's a real danger, because the truth of the matter is the innovation comes from these types of organizations. And there's a more important thing. We were talking this morning also about people. The business of a university are students, or is students. And so our most important product are our students. And as a consequence, what we've discovered over the years is that as the funding goes up and down in cycles, so do our students' interest in these areas. And so the future innovators that are going to have to carry the ball 10, 15, 20 years from now, we're going to have problems if in fact we don't educate a new generation of individuals to actually do the innovation. So that's the real danger. It's the human resources danger that is probably the greatest.
Yeah. So David, Mike, thank you very much. I think, you know, you've given us a glimpse of an extremely complex world called energy. It's not simple, but, you know, the herd is out, the market has spoken. I think renewable energy is on the run. I think withdrawing from Paris, you know, we could cede our innovation leadership and kind of business leadership almost to China and to other countries. So there's a real danger there. I think, you know, don't underestimate the power of financial innovation. I've learned, was it tax equity flipped structure? Did I get that right?
Yep.
I love these new terms. They just, you know, they make people nervous sometimes. But I think the most important thing is, you know, it's on the march. I think this bottom-up change is something that's not going to change. And I think the future ahead is exciting, but it is complex. And I think technology, I mean, storage is obviously an extreme, it's not short of research and money, but it's obviously a complex problem, the density of energy storage. So again, please thank Mike and Dave. Thanks, guys.